doesn't create but gives instruction to the demiurge who does all of the creation for him. But we don't get to see or experience the real power that is the divine ultimate. And I think that in the early church, people were talking more about this divine ultimate that is beyond the Jewish law, that is beyond the teachings in the Torah, and this idea of you can go beyond that, we can reach beyond that. This really, really powerful, but also very politically diversive kind of let's separate, the kind of the wheat from the chaff. We've got to really knuckle down and say what we believe and what we don't believe. But I firmly believe, and it's also been noted by Nathaniel Deutsch in one of his books on Gnosticism, that if the Gnostic Church had been successful, then the beginning part of the Bible would not be the Old Testament, which was the Jewish law books, but it would be most likely something from Plato, such as Timaeus, which has got this equally fantastic creation idea and creation myth and story with great teachings in it. So it's really likely that it would have been something from the Platonic school of thought. We see the triple goddess, and this is Hecate. But we have to think that we have two versions of Hecate. We have the goddess who helps Demeter, who's kind of looking for Persephone in the underworld and helps her do that. But we also see Hecate in the Chaldean tradition, in the Chaldean oracles, as the world's soul. And she fulfills that place which we understand on the Kabbalistic tree of life, which would be Binah. This is the idea of this divine being, that through Hecate you can then reach the power of the sun, you can then reach Aion or Aeon, which is the eternity of eternities and all realities of eternity. So we see a lot of this allusion to the world's soul in Hecate and the triple goddess. So when we see three Marys at the grave, there's an allusion to we are the world's soul, we are giving this transmission, and through us, through the veneration of the Mary, through the veneration of Sophia and the divine feminine, then you can access the divine logos, which is the Jesus idea and the energy beyond Jesus, the Christ current. And this is the tradition which comes from the ancient Greeks, that you don't go directly to the solar power or Apollo, you go via a route which is an intermediary deity, so, an intermediary goddess, which would be a lunar goddess. And there is aspects of Hecate which is very much to do with the moon, very much to do with liminal places, liminal spaces, and the edge of society, which of course she would have been in this sense of, a woman from the city who has sinned. Now, it wasn't until, much later that people started to, say about prostitution and things like that. What was this sin? She's a woman. What was she doing? She must have been a prostitute or an adulteress or something. But the other idea of a sin that a woman may do is the fact that she may have had foreign gods that or had a particular religious practice which was not conducive to Jewish law. And her practice was something unfamiliar and something which was marginal. So this idea of sin was also wrapped up in venerating foreign gods. And of course we see in this image we have Hecate also wearing the Polos headdress. We also see Hecate in this guise as well, also from Blake. So we see the naked priestesses in the cave, but also the donkey, which the donkey kind of represents the lower man, the lower mind, and kind of bypassing and surpassing and moving beyond the animal nature, the nephesh soul, the animal soul. So and there's an interesting piece that has come in a later teaching, which we get it very often in some of the teachings, which talks about being naked and laying down with your face in the dirt to really go into these practices and being naked before God. to really go into these. Of course, women couldn't do that. It was really bad for that kind of thing. You had to be unveiled, to be naked. It was really, really inappropriate, and people would be stoned for that kind of thing. But there seems to be an allusion towards practices where, in order to experience really heightened ecstatic states of this, kind of, kneeling in the dirt with your face, kind of this fear of God. And we get it in Rudolf Otto, who wrote a very, very fantastic inspirational book, Das Heilige, which is the idea of the holy. And it's in translation, but it is a wonderful book which talks about awe and inspiration and what these things really, really mean when we talk about the fear of God and being God-fearing and things. That it's part of a mystical process that really needs to be embraced. So we see Hecate as the idea of the three witches in the cave, muttering and doing diabolical things. And we see that aspect of Mary as well, Mary Magdalene. So it also took me back to, this is a traditional costume, a bride's costume from the Galilee. This is a modern photograph of a lady wearing an antique outfit. And this is amazing because we also see Mary Magdalene as the bride. We see priestess, bride and goddess in one. And that is, again, she's wearing very, very heavy beading, she's wearing very heavy ornamentation, things which were ostentatious. But this is the garb of the bride. And people still wear these outfits. I did quite a thorough search looking for bridal wear in the Galilee and Palestine and Jerusalem, and I looked all around the area. And these are current pictures. Again, this is from about 1890. This one, 1890. This is 1920, and this is me in the middle. Because that would be my kind of ritual wear or something, back in the day. This is a photograph that was done by for a magazine, actually, by a photographer, and it was only many years after that I was doing some event. I was conducting a wedding, and afterwards, at the kind of afterwards, this man walked in who had not been part of the bridal party, and he did a double take, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, you took me right back to being in Palestine at the end of the war and seeing women going to weddings," and it struck me as a really strong energy that's still there psychologically in the kind of priestess tradition of the bride, of the dressing up, and again, as the one in the black and white, she's wearing the really high polos, and these ones are more, maybe a bit more peasanty. We also have to look at modern traditions, and Mary Magdalene, I affectionately call her Space Helmet Mary Mag, because this is one of the ones that they use quite a lot on programmes such as Ancient Aliens and things, but there seems to be a real strong resonance with this power, and you've been there, haven't you? You've seen it.
The skull,
yes.
The Basilica of St Maximin.
Yeah, so looking at that, and again in this image, she's got the long hair, and again in ancient times, in the biblical times, it would be really, really unusual for women to walk around with their hair flowing, that they would have their head covered, they would be veiled in certain ways. And this tradition of veiling actually came from the Assyrians. So even at the same time frame and earlier, we have people who in Athens, modern Greek women at that same time period, wearing the equivalent of burqas and things like that, which people don't realise. They see documentaries and kind of Alexander the Great and all that. At that time, women would have been fully veiled, and it's a very interesting thing that someone who was in mourning would have unkempt hair, unwashed hair, dirty clothes, and they would really go through that experience of showing mourning. The this is something different. This is a modern tradition of Santa Muerte, who is a fantastic deity that's venerated in Mexico. And she's venerated by, again, the marginalised, people who are sailing close to the wind in the legal sense. She's venerated by prisoners. She's venerated by people who are, part of the drug cartels and things like that. And but also poor people. They approach Santa Muerte, and she is regarded as the originally she's probably some Aztec goddess that they've maintained and kept going. But in the Catholic tradition, she's regarded as the Virgin Mary's secret sister, her dark sister. That this is part of this tradition of most holy death, and in approaching death and becoming at one with most holy death, and dressing her up and shrines and things like that. We see other ones as well. We see this fantastic parade, and this is Mexico City. Just a nice street parade with people pinning money onto her, and this is someone's personal altar, which I was able to find it online. So that there are lots of images of the sacred skull, and the talking head, the skull that's got wisdom, and definitely the feminine skull, not the male skull. There's a lot here of devotion and practices that are very much to do with the marginalised. So we see this aspect of Mary Magdalene as the death mother, as the one who brings the dead out of their graves. Again, going right back to this idea of Inanna and Ishtar, bringing Tammuz back from the underworld.
Who was Inanna?
Inanna was a Sumerian goddess, so it's very, very ancient practice. So we see many versions of these, but these were sex goddesses. They were venerated as sex goddesses. So Aphrodite, Inanna, Ishtar, Asherah, all of these aspects of the goddess were renowned for having temples of sacred prostitution. And it was regarded as an important thing that before a girl became a bride, that she would go and she would serve one night in the temple of Aphrodite. And the same thing in the tradition to do with Ishtar as well, that you would go and serve one night as a sacred prostitute, where anyone would come in and have relations, kind of unio mystica, kind of sacred marriage with the goddess. And for that one night you were the goddess. So the tradition is very, very strong of sacred prostitution in the ancient world. So when people refer to Mary Magdalene as a prostitute, we're not talking about a common streetwalker. We're not talking about somebody who's, kind of turning tricks to get by to buy drugs. We're looking at somebody who is in a very strong tradition of that veneration of the sacred feminine and the veneration of the higher powers that manifest through the body as well as speech and mind and so on. And again, we have another Santa Muerte, but in parallel we see this Black Diana, who is also an aspect of the Artemis vibration, a moon goddess. So this is a Roman second century sculptor who's done this. So around the time of the carving of the Artemis of Ephesus, there were three versions, and the one that I showed was the Great Artemis, which was the first one in the group. So this idea of this Artemis energy and this black stone. Scholarship now knows that Artemis of Ephesus and Artemis of the Greeks and Romans are not the same deity. It's a completely different deity, related probably more to Cybele in the Ephesian tradition. In the area of Caria where the temple of Artemis was, just very, very close, kind of 20-minute drive away, we also have the temple of Lagina, which was the first shrine of the goddess Hecate, which is a massive temple complex, which I was very lucky to go there and do the reactivation of the site in 2006. I was the officiating priestess at that event. Invited by the Turkish government and Ministry of Tourism and Archaeology. So there is this sense of wanting to bring back these ancient things. But the very interesting thing, it was a Friday evening, and the mosque was just kind of doing all of their prayers, and they're just shouting and doing the calls to prayer, and all of the villagers left the mosque and the market square and all surged to the temple of Hecate, because they wanted to meet the ancient goddess. And in the Holy of Holies, in the shrine,
Wow.
we still found offerings and keys and things like that were being made as a continuation of practice by locals. So,
Which was this place?
in Lagina,
Bakin.
in Ikaria, it's in Turkey. So if you have a holiday in Bodrum, you can have a little side trip and find it. The actual name of the modern village is Turgut. So this is again a modern image that you see this in a lot of modern books. Kind of Mary Magdalene, the priestess, Mary Magdalene, the source of wisdom, and things like that. But again, the lady in red, and this very strong red power, which takes us right back to this idea of blood mysteries and blood rites and menstruation and things like that. I'm not into all of that kind of discover your womb and things like that business. I'm really not into all of that, but a lot of people get a lot from that, on this kind of women's circles and discussing, kind of feminine energy and all these kind of things, which of course men are not party to that. You've got women mysteries and male mysteries, and women's mysteries may involve things like how to take your bra off without taking your shirt off and things like that. That's my idea of women's mysteries. So but I'd like to just share with you the Brazilian idea of Maria Padilla, and she is the manifestation of the Three Marys. So in my modern, interpretation of Maria Trismegister, we have Maria Trismegister as a modern expression, which goes back to probably the 1930s. At the same time, because in Brazil they have fantastic practices that are African-based practices in candomblé and JJ and voodooistic type practices, which have come from the Yoruba practices, but also this integration and syncretism between Catholicism and the kind of Western, French Spiritism and European Spiritism that was brought to Brazil with Kardec, Kardecism. So we see Kardec as a really powerful force in Spiritism and Spiritist circles. And then in the 1930s, there were moves to move away from this very kind of quite dull and very Methodist-looking kind of Spiritism that was brought by Kardec. And then we see the development of Umbanda, and this is a really powerful practice, which you get more, kind of mixed race people in Brazil who are taking part in this, and it's more of an ecstatic practice. But we also have in the Maria Padilla, she is. There are versions of her. We see this aspect of let's not say the goddess, because that's really a bit kind of a misnomer, but this sacred divine entity, where we see Eshu and the Pombagiras. And the Pombagiras are the female counterparts of Eshu, and Eshu is the lord of the openings, lord of the crossroads, lord who opens the gates. He's the St. Peter of the kind of Brazilian outfit. He's the kind of St. Peter character. And of course we have the Pombagiras, who represent the kind of sacred feminine prostitution sort of aspect. And we see gypsies in this thing, a whole kind of setup of venerating gypsy spirits, and doing the whole thing of, we have the Eastern practice of the the kind of belly dancing looking lady, but we also have the tradition of the flamenco gypsy, the card reader, the palmist, and like this kind of thing. And Maria Padilla, she is one of these pombagiras, which she comes forward as an emanation of the three Marys. Sort of an integrated power of those three Marys, or what we'd understand as Sophia. And this is in the possession tradition. This is a modern gira in Umbanda, where we have all of the people celebrating and someone who's going into a possessed state, into a trance. And the interesting thing with Maria Padilla is she always has a cigarette and she always likes to drink. And in those traditions is that when the spirit starts to manifest, that the person is dressed and the incarnating or embodying spirit is given the things that they like. You know, the mirror and the, you know, kind of cigarette and here's your drink and things like that. So we see lots and lots of that. Pontoliscados of the three Marys. Now we see here, this is the actual call sign, and we see a man in the image who was actually making the sign. And I had to search to find an image of him doing it correctly, because you are not allowed to sit, you can only squat. And that in itself is a practice that's quite torturous, because some of these are very involved. And to draw these out in the very, very special chalk that they use. And this is it's the spirit's signature. And any offerings that can be made, that would be put on there. You can put candles on there, you can put flowers on there, and you're feeding the spirit, you're feeding the energy, which is the three Marys spirit, or the Sophia spirit that's been invoked. And it's invoked through song and dance and drumming and so on. And a very similar thing, which is Ponto Riscado, which is the Khmer cross. And the idea of Saint Sarah, who was a gypsy. So it takes us right back to this gypsy tradition of the marginalised. But it also takes us back to this idea of slaves who were brought to Brazil, slaves who were brought to who were brought to the Americas, who were brought to Haiti and to Cuba, Jamaica, that they were brought against their will, you know. So in the same sense that if Saint Sarah was an Egyptian servant, well, we really mean a slave. If it was somebody who they met in the Camargue who was also a gypsy, it was someone who had been kind of exiled, you know, people who were like marginalised. Move on, move on, move on. In the same way that slaves were sold from plantation to plantation and moved on and this kind of thing. So we see this idea of Saint Sarah really, really powerful in the Brazilian tradition as a kind of a patron of people who have got slave background or being, you know, kind of held in captivity. We don't see this aspect in the kind of this idea of Judaism, but I'm sure that there is an aspect there of people who have been in slavery, people who have been kind of held against their will and you know, being told to move on and move on. The whole of the Bible and the Old Testament is a story of exile. So in the embodiment of Mary Magdalene, we have a representation of exile in a physical manifestation of all of the experiences of all of the ancient patriarchs is being retold and being played out in the embodiment of one individual, which of course we don't want to be reminded of that only on special occasions while doing, you know, proper things. You know, we don't want to be reminded of because she's not saying what we think, she's saying something different, and it's this Jesus thing and we're not quite sure what that's about. So we see this idea there of marginalisation, and we also see exile as well, because of course, one thing we were talking about last night, we sat until about 2:30 in the morning chatting about different things, that as an apostola, as someone who is sent out, as an apostle, it means someone who is sent out. And in fact, if you are sent out, it's very, very likely that you're going to go back or you're going to return. You know, so people are saying goodbye to the apostle in the sense of they're going to their death. You know, they're going to another world. In the same way that often people who are bereaved, they imagine that, you know, for a way of coping, they imagine that their loved one has gone to live in America or Australia, and, you know, they may not see them ever again, but, you know, there's this idea that they're still around in some other dimension. The idea of an apostle is someone who is sent out, and again, obviously not welcome in every place. The interesting thing about St. Paul and his ministry, his idea about the practices of Artemis, and he was very vocal about the practices of Artemis, and he went kind of destroying shrines and things, and he was put in prison for this, because of course in that tradition Artemis was the saviour, you know. So of course St. Paul comes along and goes, I want to tell you about the saviour, and everyone's like, well, no, we've got a saviour, it's Artemis, what are you talking about? We don't want another one. So this idea of not being welcome, people being sent into exile, people being set adrift, and the idea that Mary Magdalene and her crew, you know, her close friends, Joseph of Arimathea, and you know the Egyptian servant girl, cast adrift, which we get in the ancient stories. Not that ancient, but going back to about 6th century AD, in the Irish stories of Bran and Columba and these sort of stories of people being kind of put to death by being cast adrift, and this idea of the rudderless boats, you know, kind of if God takes a hand in it, you'll be saved, you'll be guided by the hand of God, and you'll find safety. But in some of the Irish stories, which were all preserved by Christian monks, you know, they're not traditional Irish stories that have been kind of preserved in an oral tradition, but then being kind of influenced by Christianity. And we see very, very strong ideas in this idea of being cast adrift. That the people that Bran meets, who, you know, the various, you know, characters meet, that they're actually being cast adrift, made their way to a kind of weird island, and it's a kind of, you know, cannibal world where you're kind of fighting for survival. So this idea of cannibalism and blood rights and things like that is very, very strong. And I remember when I was about 11 reading books on the Cathars and seeing these accounts that they were accused of cannibalism and drinking blood. So this idea of going to a place and meeting people who have got these extreme rights that we don't quite understand, and you know, we don't really, you know, we don't feel part of it. Now the Triple Mary arrives. I have to do something here which I don't quite know because it's not on here to get it to play the footage.
I don't think we'll be able to do it, my dear.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Oh, hang on a minute. What if I click on it?
Right.
No.
No, it won't play it. Just stick with the PowerPoint.
Oh, that's disappointing.
Well, we can play it this evening.
Well, how are you going to play it this evening?
Well, it'll take a whole performance to get it.
Okay, never mind.
Transferred. You can't do it now, I'm afraid.
Oh, I was so proud of myself for getting that on there. But anyway, so Saint Sarah in Brazil is very much this very powerful being, and is the patroness of pregnancy. You know, if you're having problems conceiving, there are offerings that you make to Saint Sarah, and you know, particular things that she likes, and you know, you go and you do your obligation, and she's a protector of people who are trying to conceive and pregnant women, and that is one of her main practices. But also all of the things that gypsies are involved with. So you know, making a living with no money, and you know, and doing readings and psychic work and things like that, and intuitive work. And we see here this idea of offerings where you take a handkerchief. She loves handkerchiefs, headscarves and things like that. So you take a headscarf for her as a gift and you pin it onto her dress because she loves that. And there is another version of Maria Padilla, which is Maria of the Seven Skirts, where she's got this big voluminous sort of flamenco type skirt, which is again also representative of all of the, you know, the kind of offerings of scarves and things like that, and so on. And this is an artistic representation of of Saint Sarah. Very different to the one that you see in France. So this is again tapping into that gypsy dancer kind of wild woman kind of a character. This is more of a traditional one. In Brazil, she's manifested as Santa Sara Kali. And in the Romani language, Kali means a gypsy, the Kalin. But she's become syncretised with the Indian goddess Kali, the black. So there's a connection to black people. This idea there of slaying demons and things like that, but also getting rid of blockages that might actually stop you from becoming pregnant and things like that. So there are all of these sort of areas. There's a part of me which kind of draws more towards the Greek translation, where it's not Kali but Kale. Kale means beautiful. So Sarah means princess in the Hebrew, and Kale would be beautiful. So holy, beautiful princess. That seems to be a wild claim, but possible. And then we have New Age channeling and the channeling movement that is happening now, because I wanted to really show you the arrival of the Three Marys in Brazil, because it is a really wonderful experience, because you see people dancing and the drumming and everything, and it starts off and the woman she looks like she's going to faint, and then she starts to stagger a little bit, and then she drops down, and there's similar activity that happens in all of the terreiros, all of the giras that happen for this particular aspect of the divine feminine, where she drops down, she begins to laugh, she throws her head back, and then she gets up, and then the power that moves through the person who is receiving the embodiment of the being, it's absolutely incredible. And she starts to spin and dance and does this incredible dance, and then at the end just kind of goes, oh, hang on a minute, what have I just been doing? And then comes back to herself and just sort of stands like, oh, what happened? Which is very typical of possession trance in indigenous societies, indigenous cultures. So I've experienced quite a lot of these practices where there's an embodiment of something special and divine, and of feeding the power, so rather than just making an altar and me leaving offerings and things like that and having a prayer relationship, there's an actual experience of receiving the body of receiving the spirit of the divine being, and being transformed by that divine being. And these practices in Brazil, the Umbanda practice, it sort of developed around the same time that Gerald Gardner was developing Wicca, so there seems to be a bit of a zeitgeist around the same time that Umbanda developed at the same time. We also have Kimbanda, which is purely, it's a different practice where they use a lot of, kind of punta riscados or veves, as they call them in voodoo. But the practices are around Eshu and the Pombagiras, and particularly, so we can call it a red and black cult. And in the kind of scholarship of Kimbanda, they refer to it as a Gnostic tradition.
So can I stop you there? A red and black?
It's a red and black tradition. So everything, because all of normally in these cult practices, that the different orishas, the different spiritual beings, the different loa, that they have their favourite colours. But we see red and black and cemetery colours. We see Mary at the Seven Crossroads in the cemetery and things like that. So we see aspects of the crossroads tradition, the cemetery tradition, going to the tomb, and all of these kind of things, but replicated over and over and over again in this kind of really powerful tradition of in Kimbanda. So it is regarded as a kind of slightly dark aspect of Umbanda, whereas